Hello everyone, I'm Naveen Agarwal and I'm so excited to welcome all of you to this live episode of a discussion series we do every week. And now, this is not a webinar or a lecture. We are here to talk about common day-to-day challenges, questions, issues you face when you actually practice risk management for your medical device. Now believe me, I have worked in this area for many years and I know that in practice, risk management is pretty difficult to implement consistently across the board. So my goal here is to engage with you in a live discussion, as much as possible address common issues, common day-to-day problems, challenges that you face. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever you are. Please share in the chat below where you are joining from and what you do as part of the risk management process or the quality management system, or even product development if you are working with product development. I would love to hear from you. What are your challenges related to risk management? Share in the chat below anytime during the presentation, because sometimes it takes a while for me to receive your message and take a look at it, but I will respond and answer as much as possible, as frequently as possible as I can. So keep in mind that this is a public forum, so do not share any proprietary information or any business sensitive information. And one request I have is to please be professional at all times, especially if we disagree with any comments or discussion going on. We are not here to debate or argue. We are here to discuss and learn from each other. That is the whole intent. So let's disagree in a professional way. We are not trying to prove any point of view. Now finally, anything we discuss today should not be taken as regulatory advice. So this is only for the purpose of information only. Apart from that, it's really very open. I will set the stage with only a few slides in the beginning, and the topic is going to be severity level determination or understanding how to assign severity level. It's only a few slides as a point of introduction. Now, I have, again, as I said before, on the surface, it seems very simple, right? You set up a level 1 to 5 and use it accordingly, consistently across the board. Easier said than done. In my experience, there are many challenges, and I would love to hear from you. What are the kind of issues you are facing? But this is the topic today, but any other topic, question, issue is also welcome. It's going to be a very open conversation. So that's the whole intent. Anytime during the presentation, share your question, comment, and even best practice. You have a lot of experience, I know, and share how you have solved some of the problems you face. Maybe other people can also learn, and I can learn from that. So sounds like a plan. Let's look into this conversation today, and of course someone is joining here. So hello to you, Rupesh. Welcome to this forum, and I look forward to engaging with you today. So let's look into some of our slides. So when I come across a terminology, I always ask the question, what does the dictionary say about it? Even before I go into the ISO 14971 definition. So what is severity? Merriam-Webster dictionary defines severity as the quality or state of being severe, the condition of being very bad, serious, unpleasant, or harsh. Hello, Henny Bay, welcome. Again, I see your message, so thanks for joining. Those of you who are just joining, this is going to be a live conversation and we are focusing on severity level today, but any other topic related to risk management, quality management is also welcome. Share anytime during the chat and I will address as soon as I possibly can. So, according to the dictionary definition, severity is the quality or state of being severe, the condition of being very bad, serious, unpleasant, or harsh. So you see, already our understanding of severity from a language point of view is different from what ISO 14971 is telling us. So let's look at what ISO 14971 says. Measure of the possible consequences of a hazard. So it's a measure. It's not a state or condition, it's a measure. The first question is severity really measurable? Can we measure severity? Second point here is consequences of a hazard. There could be more than one consequence. So which consequence are we thinking about when we assign a severity level? We have to think about all of them, and we have to list all of them, and they might be of different severity levels based on some quantification or some judgment that we have. So there's a lot of confusion potentially about this definition, whether it's measurable or not, and how to actually do it. This definition doesn't tell you how to do it. So I would love to hear from you again, what it is that you do in your risk management process, and how do you handle assignment of severity levels? Please share in the chat below as we discuss these slides. So yeah, what does it mean? Industry practice, broadly speaking, they use a 5-point scale. Across the industry, in many applications, I have seen a 5-point scale. You can start from negligible all the way to life-threatening, and along the way you can have different levels. Some people use death as the highest level. We will talk about that. If you are using death as the highest level, share in the chat below. It's not right or wrong. It's a matter of practice. And let's try to understand what it means and in what way it might prove to be challenging for you. Let's talk about that. So along the way, you can have minor, major, critical. Typically, it's a 5-point scale. And see, we are using qualitative terms. Already these qualitative terms, as you know, I'm a big fan of looking up the dictionary. They give you a perception about what that level means. Is it really a 1 or a 2? We don't know, right? So a lot of things happen behind the scenes in understanding severity levels, and that's the purpose of these conversations, to dig a little bit deeper. All right, so 2 main challenges. This is my view only, and I would love to hear from you. What are the challenges and questions you face about severity levels, their assignment, their use across the board? So I see the first challenge as, if you have 1 to 5 levels, is it a linear scale? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Is it go in a straight line? Or is it an exponential scale? 4 and 5 are really much higher than 1, 2, and 3. Again, we'll have to think about that. It depends on the situation. But the key point here is that the qualitative terms used to describe levels may affect our risk perception. And in somebody's mind, we may be thinking a linear scale, 5 to 4 to 3 may be about the same effect. But in somebody else's mind, 5 is really very high, maybe death. 4, not as high, but pretty higher than 3. But how much higher, we don't know, right? Here is a comment from Rupesh that they look at it as exponentially. It is best to articulate this very clearly so that everyone looks at the scale in the right way or in a consistent way, and resolve those differences of opinions before you sort of proceduralize it. Again, this is not a question of right or wrong. This is a question of helping people understand the concept, the principle in a consistent way. Now, the second issue is, we talked about it briefly, it's a one-to-many scenario. Consequences of different severity levels possible from a single event situation, including death, could be different consequences, and as a result could be different severity level. So we have to analyze, again, this is the requirement, we have to analyze all potential scenarios resulting from a certain event, maybe even a non-event. We have talked about that in our prior discussions, how a sequence of events is followed by an initial event or a trigger event leading to a hazardous situation. And that hazardous situation may lead to many more different consequences. We have to think about all of them and try to articulate as much as possible. So these are the 2 main challenges. Now the final slide I will share with you is a brief caution. FDA is increasingly sensitive to inconsistency and underestimation. This is the reason I want to do this live discussion with you, to understand where it is that you might be having some challenges. What are some of the common questions? But here are 2 examples I will share with you. First warning letter, you can go up there, look up this reference. They're talking about, during the inspection, we reviewed a process failure mode effects and criticality analysis as part of the design history file for your blank product. This review, now the highlight is mine, this review confirmed inconsistencies in the assignment of potential severity ratings for hazards identified during the review. As an example, if you have the hazard of biocontamination, that may lead to an infection. That infection could be at a certain severity level. In the FMEA, in this situation, FDA found that for a similar situation in every case, let's say breakdown of the sterility barrier, right? Some people might assign that a severity level of 5. Some might assign it at a 4. But whatever you decide, every time you have a failure mode related to potential breakdown of sterility barrier, we should have the same level, right? that would be consistent. But FDA is not finding that in this case consistent application. So there is an inconsistency in the application of the severity level when we do our risk analysis. That's point number one. So consistency is a problem or potential risk. Now point number two is another warning letter where harms such as allergic reaction, chemical burns, hypoxia, and hypercapnia are given a score of X. I have blanked this out. In the harm severity level guidelines, there is a master document this company has, although the potential for severity of harms may be higher. So now FDA is questioning the level of severity assigned to certain harms. And remember, the consequence of a hazard may be of different degree, and we have to articulate all of them. So how do you make sure that you are assigning the right level of severity and not ignoring consequences of higher severity for that harm? It gets complicated very quickly. So I would love to hear from you. This is all I have in the slide for now. So I would love to hear from you. Let's see. Okay, Dr. Peter Dreschler, it is neither linear nor exponential since it is qualitative. You are right. What I meant to say here was the perception could be it's a linear scale or exponential scale or some other mathematical scale. We are using a 1 to 5 scale. How do we interpret that scale in practice? That is the question. So those are the two possibilities, but there might be other possibilities. Is 5 really significantly higher than a 4? Or is it about the same increase as going from 3 to 4? I think what I'm trying to say is that when we put a scale and don't have these ideas clearly discussed, a risk perception changes from person to person, and as a result, you may assign different levels of severity thinking about different scenarios in different situations, and that could result into inconsistency. So I hope that makes it clear. You are right, it's a qualitative scale. We are acknowledging it is not really measurable. So we are assigning a level, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or some people could do 1 to 3 or 1 to 10. What do those levels mean? Okay, so I hope that made sense to you, but again, I'm open to hearing more from you. How do you handle this type of issue that I've highlighted as FDA's warning letters are showing? Inconsistent application of severity levels for the same type of scenario. And second, inadequate or maybe inaccurate. In FDA's view, they are questioning in the master table the severity levels you have assigned for certain harms, because you may have considered different scenarios and made the conclusion that severity is, let's say, a 3 or a 4. But there might be other scenarios that may have happened or could happen, and the severity level is potentially higher. So a lot of confusion and opportunity for conversation here, and I would love to hear from you what kind of issues you are facing. Okay, again, we are hearing that it is wrong to use a math scale. If death is 5, what is 2.5? Absolutely. So again, the question is, to what level of precision we want? 2.5 certainly doesn't make sense. This is the discrete scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And is death really 5? To some people, it is probably infinity. If someone dies, it is absolutely the worst scenario. We never ever want to have happen. So if we are using death as 5, actually I would love to hear how do we apply that in practice? If death is 5, how do we apply that, and what does 4 mean in that case? A near-death experience? A life-threatening experience? What does it all mean? How to do risk assessment 18652 gas path. Could you please explain your question a little bit more to me? I'm not familiar with 18652. Please let me know. Okay, so let me know what is your question about 18652. So continuing on the conversation, again, it is not a quantitative scale. It is a discrete scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But still, we need to figure out what do those levels mean as written, and also how do people perceive those levels in practice. And it is my experience that different people perceive the same scale differently if we don't really explain that or align on that. Okay, so we have a comment here. In all areas, the agency expects companies to justify all decisions especially those having to do with risk. Definitions should be clear at the particular company and they should be able to justify them. It varies depending on the company and the product. We have another comment, just have categories. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 could be a category, or qualitative terms like we talked about, negligible, minor, major. Okay, so yes, the expectation is clear definition. And I would actually share with you that every procedure I have come across, these terms are defined. It is not that the definitions are lacking. What I'm curious to learn from your experience, how are these terms applied and what kind of potential issues you face while trying to decide in a certain scenario if it's severity level 3 or 4. How do you make those judgments? How do you make those decisions? I would love to learn from you what happens and there's a lot of debate. 3 versus 4 or 2 versus 5. And again, I'm making up these scenarios. Would love to learn from you and hear from you what it is that you find challenging when trying to assign a severity level. Let's say you are trying to develop a master harms table, or you might call it a certain different name, but let's say a table which lists down all the harms, and this was actually in the FDA warning letter, right? List of harms and their severity levels. How do we come to that assignment? And in that case, FDA is actually questioning that level. They are thinking it's probably higher. You have not assigned the right level. So the conversation here I'm hoping to have with you today is what happens in real life? What happens in practice? Okay, while you're thinking about that, we have a comment here, biocompatibility risk assessments. Yes, so it's less of a matter of a specific risk assessment. In general, you need to have these levels assigned for the consequence of a hazard. That's how this severity level is defined. Whatever we think, so non-biocompatibility would be a hazard. Let's talk about that. Biocompatibility is a requirement. Non-biocompatibility would be a hazard. Now, what are the consequences of that non-biocompatibility? It depends on the situation, the circumstance, the way it becomes effective or activated. I like to use the word hazard exposure. And some event or a non-event is activating this exposure to hazard. It is not necessarily the failure of the device. So whether it's biocompatibility, whether it is cybersecurity, whether it is something else, we still have to develop this scale. Okay, so let's continue this conversation. This is very good discussion. Let's continue this and see how we can learn a little bit more about this from real life, real world examples, real world practice. Expectation is very clearly defined scale. What happens in practice is of interest in this conversation. I would love to hear from you how it is that you come up with a scale and what kind of challenges you face when using that scale and what kind of conversations are happening, if there are any. And believe me, I have seen some of those challenges, but I would love to hear from you. What is your practice and how it is helping you either do things well? So if there's a best practice, please share, or if there's a challenge. Sometimes many of us are actually doing things that are working well for us. And part of the intent of this conversation is to promote a collective sharing of these best practices. So I hope to hear from you. Please continue to share in the chat as you have been doing. Let me know what's on your mind. So while you're thinking about that, I want to go back to the FDA examples that I showed with you, discussed with you. Let's talk about inconsistency first. And I gave the example of, let's say, a breakdown of a sterile barrier. The hazard in that case is really biocontamination, which has the potential to cause infection. Now, in our FMEA, and we have talked about FMEAs being used as risk analysis tools and what challenges that might offer us. But let's say we are using an FMEA, we might have 10 different failure modes resulting into compromise of the sterility barrier. The expectation would be to see the same severity level assigned. Now, we may be thinking that if this failure mode occurs, maybe it's less likely that the patient will have infection. Maybe we are thinking that way. And again, I would love to hear from you. If that's the case, if they're less likely, maybe we are thinking the severity is not high and we are confusing likelihood with severity. So I've seen that in practice. And that's why it may be leading to inconsistencies. Again, just an example, but I would love to hear from you what it is that you have experienced. Now, the second reason for inconsistency that I could think of is different people having different interpretations of what 3 means or what 4 means. Let's say the master harms table is telling you it's a level 4. Now, many more reasons to go into what happens in practice, why some people might think really 4 is not applicable in this scenario. If you believe that is the case, I think the right question to ask is, are we thinking about the same harm then? If we are thinking about the same harm, it doesn't matter where it comes from. Our master severity level should be applicable. So those are the kind of issues that I have seen personally, and I would love to again hear from you what it is that you are seeing. And the more we talk about what you are experiencing, the more relevant it will be for this conversation. So I really invite you to engage and participate in this discussion. So I see I have another comment here. So the scenario that is being described for biocompatibility risk assessment, if contamination in gas path, patient inhaling. So okay, so now we are talking about where the contamination is, right? So if it is in the gas path and the gas is now being exposed and then it's carrying the infectious agent, and as a result it's ending up into the airways and maybe patient is inhaling that infected gas, sure. So in that scenario, you have to play it out, right? How long is the exposure? How much volume is going on? And what is the patient's condition? So you have to play out what I call the sequence of events. Now, it may get complicated if you play it out in every potential scenario. So in many cases in our industry, what we say, think about the worst case. And it again is a matter of judgment. The best thing to do is to work with medical experts, people who have actual medical expertise in the field using that device, because they are able to help you articulate the sequence of events. What exactly might happen and what is the risk level based on both likelihood and severity. So it is not necessarily a straightforward answer that if contamination happens in the pathway where the gas is flowing and patient is breathing, let's say it's an oxygenator or oxygen delivery, yes, you have to consider all possible scenarios and sequence of events. You may come across a situation where the exposure is not very high, and in that case, using a generic term for harm such as infection may not be useful. You may have to define more precisely from a medical point of view what is the actual harm that you are articulating or expecting in that scenario, and you have to play that out. So I hope that makes sense, and I just want us to think that there is a lot more to it than just coming out with failure modes effect analysis, which I've seen in the industry all the time. But we have to take the next step after device failure or maybe a use error. What are the sequence of events that might happen? And that analysis is done as part of your hazard analysis. And that's where you have input from clinicians and medical experts, which becomes very, very important. So having said that, I actually thought about this the other day, is what about the patient's perspective? Now we are expecting the medical experts and the clinicians to provide us the patient's view. And in many cases they will. But every patient is different, right? And that particular clinician or a medical expert may have seen only a limited range of patients or limited types of situations. So it's always best to also talk to more people. Keep an eye on your post-market surveillance process, right? That's where clause 10 in ISO 14971 is so big now. It is expecting us to learn constantly from post-market. Maybe we didn't think about different sequence of events and hazardous situations in our first analysis. And as a result, our assessment of the potential harm and the potential severity level was maybe not adequate at that for the current situation. So we need to go back and revise it. So all those things the point here is that, and that's why risk management becomes difficult, right? Because it's constantly changing. And that's the life cycle side of it is where I think industry practice becomes very challenging. It's the life cycle aspect. Design and development, great. We are developing a product, maybe it's similar. We have a starting risk analysis. We have a starting harms table. Let's do it. What happens 1 year down the road, 2 years down the road as we learn more? we have to constantly rethink our analysis. We have to constantly figure out how to see if our severity levels are correctly applied or not, which is where I think these two examples that I shared with you from the FDA are shedding some light. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. And again, this is the kind of conversation we want to have here. We are really thinking about actual practice. What happens in the real world, real practice? You have a procedure, you have a table, tells you what level 1 to 5 are. What are the definitions of that? We try to be as clear as possible. But still, we have examples where we have inconsistency, and we have examples where we have not assigned the right level of severity. I'm not saying it's happening with you, but I'm sure you are having these conversations as you begin to develop these systems and processes and as you actually implement them. That has been my experience, and I would love to hear from you. What is your experience about this? Okay, so let's see what we have here. I hope to hear more from you. Let me say a little bit more about the post-market process again, because that to me is an area where we really need to, in my personal opinion, pay a lot more attention than purely analyzing complaints for reportability. Now, that's a regulatory requirement. Reportability is a regulatory requirement. But in my mind, post-market surveillance goes a lot beyond that. Post-market surveillance is really trying to understand what is happening in the real world with our product and its use, and how best we can respond to it if things happen, and proactively mitigate those opportunities for patient harm and bring it back into our process. And that is where things get a lot more challenging. Okay, so we are kind of coming close to the end of our discussion today. These are 30 minutes long typically, and depends upon how much conversation we have through your comments. We can go a little bit over. But to recap, let me emphasize a few key points. The first one is severity levels. Very, very correct. It is not a mathematical scale. But when we assign numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in our mind, we are thinking a numerical scale. So it's important to be clear about what those levels mean and what they don't mean, so that people do not have these risk perception driven decisions which are going on behind the scenes. And all of us actually are subject to that. There's a lot of research that has happened in the past about risk perception and how people feel about risk. It's not quantitative all the time. So the key point here, key takeaway message here is that define the levels, but make sure people understand them, what they are. Is it a linear scale, exponential scale? Are 4 or 5 really different than 2 or 3? Or it is about the same? Question of death came up a little bit. We didn't talk a lot more about it. We can discuss that in future sessions. I have seen that happen, death being number 5. Now, several of the medical people I have talked to have different views on it. Death is an outcome, and it's a potential outcome of a long series of events that may be interrelated with each other. So it may not be directly assignable or related to your product. If it is, you could use it, but I like to use life-threatening as number 5. Life-threatening has the option, or it includes death as an outcome. But if you define death as an outcome, guess what? If it's not death, you cannot use 5 in your risk scale at all. It's not usable. But if it is important and critical, yes, it makes sense. But in many cases, it may not make sense. So that was number 2. Number 3, we talked about inconsistency and observation about incorrect assignment of severity levels. And that's a watch out. We have to pay attention to how consistently we are applying them. And that relates to how we have defined our scale and how people understand that scale. And second, about inaccuracy in assignment of the severity level, that may be informed over time through the post-market process. We may do our best shot before, but over time we may have to review and revise that. If we are receiving complaints of the same harm at a higher severity level, we need to go back and update that. So we may have to change that thinking. Okay, I will take one last comment here because it just came in. Post-market risk assessment to be done, altering severity or probability level. Yes, that is correct. And we have to figure out a way to make that easy for people to review data, analyze data, and implement. It's all a matter of how we do it, how efficiently we do it. Well, folks, so we are over time now, and I want to thank you for joining again. We will do this every week. I invite you to join next time. Connect with me on LinkedIn. That's the best way to get in touch with me. Share your comments, questions, suggestions, and topics for our future conversations. I would really look forward to hearing from you. And if you cannot join, there'll be a recording available very soon. Share that with friends and colleagues who you think might benefit from attending these events. Last but not the least, I want to share with you some free resources. Now, this is a website that I have, achieveexcel.com. Here is the website, and if you go to this tab called free stuff, I have 2 good quality free stuff for you. One is a template for hazard analysis, which will be followed with several videos on how to use that template. And the second is an invitation to join my knowledge sharing forum. And it's free to join. We are talking about many different topics, and it's an ongoing way of engaging offline. So I invite you to take advantage of these free offers. With that, thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you next week in another live discussion.